The blood on Lillian James's dress wasn't hers, but no one in Silver Creek seemed to care about that distinction. They only saw a woman standing over her dead husband with a kitchen knife nearby and made their judgments accordingly. Not that they had particularly liked Frank James before his death, a mean drunk with a penchant for gambling and a heavy hand, but folks in small frontier towns had their ways of thinking about women who outlived their husbands under suspicious circumstances. Gabriel Hayes had seen her brought into town that spring morning of 1878, riding in Sheriff Thornton's wagon with her hands bound, and her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the dusty Main Street. He'd been watering his horse outside the general store when the commotion started, townsfolk gathering to gawk at the so-called murderess as if she were a circus attraction. Killed her husband while he slept, someone whispered nearby. Slit his throat, another added, though Gabriel knew for a fact that Frank James had been shot by a furious card player at the Broken Spur Saloon. He'd been there, seen the whole thing. But it seemed convenient for folks to believe the worst about the quiet woman who'd moved to town only 6 months prior. Gabriel had kept his silence then, just as he had about most things since returning from the war over a decade ago. A man of 34 with calloused hands and a life carved from the harsh Wyoming territory, he found peace in solitude and hard work on his small ranch outside of town. He hadn't intended to get involved in Lillian James's troubles. Not until Judge Mason arrived 3 days later and made his proclamation on the courthouse steps. "The evidence is circumstantial," the judge had announced to the disappointed crowd. "Without witnesses to the act itself, Mrs. James cannot be convicted of murder." The crowd had murmured its disapproval, but the judge raised his hand. However, given the suspicious nature of her husband's death and her unnatural calmness afterward, it is the opinion of this court that she is not of sound character. As such, she is hereby ordered to leave Silver Creek within 7 days, unless— the judge paused, scanning the crowd— unless a man of good standing is willing to take responsibility for her conduct. Not a single man stepped forward. Women whispered behind their hands. Gabriel shifted uncomfortably, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "She worked at Widow Parker's boarding house before she married Frank," someone called out. "Perhaps she could return there." Widow Parker herself spoke up from the crowd. "I'll not have her back." Bad for business, having a woman suspected of cutting her husband's throat while he slept. Gabriel's jaw tightened at the lie. He'd seen Frank James get shot plain as day, watched him fall across the poker table with cards still clutched in his hand. He'd been about to say something when the judge's gavel cracked against the wooden railing. 7 days, Mrs. James. After which, you leave Silver Creek for good. Gabriel had walked away then, determined to stay out of it, but that night he couldn't sleep. Images of Lillian James's face, not fearful as it should have been, but resigned, as if she'd expected nothing better from life, haunted him. By morning, he'd made his decision. He found her at the cemetery, standing over a fresh grave that bore no marker. The townsfolk hadn't seen fit to provide Frank James with a headstone, and his widow apparently couldn't afford one. She wore the same dress she'd been arrested in, the bloodstains now brown against the faded blue fabric. "Mrs. James," Gabriel said, removing his hat as he approached. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him at all. "I'm Gabriel Hayes. I own a small spread about 5 miles west of town." "I know who you are, Mr. Hayes," she replied, her voice softer than he expected. "You were at the saloon the night Frank died." So she knew the truth. Gabriel cleared his throat. "Yes, madam, I was." "And did you tell anyone what you saw?" "No, madam." Shame colored his words. "I did not." Now she turned to face him, and Gabriel was struck by the clarity in her green eyes. There was no accusation there, just a weary acceptance that surprised him more than anger would have. "Then you're like all the rest," she said, turning back to the grave. "I'm here now," Gabriel offered. "I can tell the judge what really happened. It won't matter." She shook her head slightly. "They've made up their minds about me. Frank had debts all over town. His death was convenient for many people, and blaming his crazy wife keeps anyone from looking too closely at who might have wanted him dead." Gabriel shifted uncomfortably. "The judge said you have to leave town, unless some fool man decides to take me in." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "I don't need charity, Mr. Hayes. It's not charity I'm offering." The words came out before he could consider them properly. "It's a fair arrangement." That caught her attention. She turned to him fully now, eyes narrowed. "What kind of arrangement?" Gabriel took a deep breath. "I need help on my ranch. It's too much for one person and I can't afford to hire hands year-round. You'd have your own room, of course. I've got a small cabin, but it's clean and warm." "And what would you expect in return, Mr. Hayes?" Her tone had turned icy defensive. "Just work, madam. Cooking, maybe some help with the livestock, nothing." He felt heat rise in his face. Nothing improper. Lillian James studied him for a long moment. Gabriel fought the urge to look away from her scrutiny. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." "I know what I saw that night," Gabriel said firmly, "and I know it wasn't right how they treated you after." She considered this, her gaze drifting back to the unmarked grave. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted quietly. "But I won't be treated like property again. If I come with you, we'll have an understanding that I'm free to leave whenever I choose." "Of course," Gabriel agreed, relief washing over him. "And I'll work for my keep, nothing more." "Nothing more," he echoed. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Hayes." She extended her hand formally, like a man closing a business deal. Gabriel took it, surprised by the strength in her grip. "We can leave today if you'd like. Do you have belongings to collect?" "Everything I own is in a single trunk at the jail. Sheriff Thornton wouldn't let me back in the house after." She gestured vaguely toward the grave. "I'll get it for you." Gabriel replaced his hat. "Meet me at the general store in an hour. We'll need supplies." As he walked away, he couldn't help wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Taking in a woman the entire town had rejected wasn't the act of a man who wanted a quiet life. But something about Lillian James's steady gaze, and the injustice of her situation, had stirred something in him that he thought had died long ago in the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg. The whispers started as soon as they entered the general store together. Lillian held her head high, ignoring the sudden silence and pointed stares as they moved through the aisles. Gabriel added items to their basket methodically: coffee, flour, sugar, salt pork. He noticed Lillian eyeing a bolt of simple cotton fabric but moving past it without comment. "We'll take 5 yards of that," Gabriel told the shopkeeper, nodding toward the fabric. Lillian's eyes widened slightly. "That's not necessary. You'll need proper clothes for ranch work," he replied quietly. "Consider it part of your wages." The shopkeeper, Tom Bradley, made a show of measuring the fabric, his movements deliberately slow. "Heard you're taking in Frank's widow," he said, not looking up from his work. "Mighty Christian of you, Hayes." "Just doing what's right," Gabriel replied evenly. "Well, just so you know, most folks round here won't be receiving her in their homes." Bradley finally looked up, his expression hard. "Woman's got a cloud over her." Gabriel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You and I both know Frank James died at the Broken Spur with a bullet in his chest, not a knife in his back." Bradley's eyes darted nervously to Lillian, who stood examining a display of canned goods with careful attention. "That may be," he muttered, "but she ain't natural. Frank told plenty about how she'd just stare out windows for hours, not speaking. Said sometimes she'd wake up screaming about things no one could see. Sounds to me like Frank talked too much, Gabriel replied coldly. We'll take those supplies now. The journey to Gabriel's ranch took nearly 2 hours. They rode in silence, Gabriel on his chestnut gelding and Lillian on a gentle mare he'd purchased from the livery. Her trunk and their supplies were loaded on a small cart hitched to Gabriel's horse. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling grasslands as they approached a modest cabin nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. It wasn't much a single-story log structure with a small barn and corral nearby, but Gabriel felt a surge of pride as they approached. He'd built every inch of it with his own hands after staking his claim 5 years earlier. It's not what you're used to, I expect, he said as they dismounted. Lillian surveyed the property, her expression unreadable. It's peaceful, she finally said. I like that it faces east. Gabriel hadn't thought about it before, but she was right. The front of the cabin caught the morning sun perfectly. Makes for bright mornings, he agreed. I've always loved watching the sunrise, she said quietly, almost to herself. Then, as if remembering where she was, she straightened her shoulders. Where would you like me to put my things? Gabriel showed her to the small room off the main living area. It wasn't much, just enough space for a narrow bed and a chest for her belongings, but the window faced east, catching the same morning light as the front of the cabin. I hope this will be comfortable enough, he said, suddenly aware of how sparse it must seem compared to the house in town she'd shared with Frank. Lillian set her trunk down and looked around the small space. It's more than enough, Mr. Hayes. Thank you. Gabriel, he corrected her. If we're to live and work together, you might as well use my given name. She hesitated, then nodded. Gabriel, she repeated, testing the name, and you may call me Lillian. That evening they ate a simple meal of beans and salt pork that Gabriel prepared. He explained the workings of the ranch, the small herd of cattle, the vegetable garden, the chickens that provided eggs and occasional meat. Lillian listened attentively, asking practical questions about the water source and winter preparations. I usually preserve as much as I can from the garden, Gabriel explained, but I'm not particularly skilled at it. I can help with that, Lillian offered. My mother taught me how to preserve just about anything. They settled into a routine over the following days. Gabriel would rise at dawn to tend the livestock while Lillian prepared breakfast. They worked separately throughout the morning, Gabriel mending fences or tending the herd, Lillian taking charge of the garden and chickens. They would meet for a midday meal, then continue their tasks until evening. It was a quiet existence, punctuated by brief, practical conversations. Gabriel learned that Lillian had come west from Pennsylvania 2 years earlier, following the death of her parents. She'd taken a position at the boarding house in Silver Creek, where she'd met Frank James, a charming newcomer with grand plans for starting a business. He wasn't always cruel, she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the horizon in shades of orange and purple. At first he was kind, even gentle, but after we married he changed, or perhaps he simply stopped pretending. Gabriel didn't press for details, but he noticed how she would sometimes flinch at sudden movements or grow quiet when certain topics arose. He began to understand what the shopkeeper had meant about her, staring out windows. Sometimes Lillian would become lost in thought, her gaze fixed on some distant point, her body present but her mind clearly elsewhere. One night, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Gabriel woke to the sound of screaming. He bolted from his bed, grabbing the rifle he kept nearby, certain they were under attack. But as his mind cleared from sleep, he realized the sounds were coming from Lillian's room. He knocked urgently on her door. "Lillian, are you all right?" The screaming stopped, replaced by ragged breathing, After a moment, her shaky voice responded, "I'm fine, just a dream." Gabriel hesitated outside her door. "Can I get you anything? Water, perhaps?" There was a long pause before she replied, "No, thank you. I'm sorry I woke you." "No need to apologize," he assured her, though he remained by her door for several minutes, listening to make sure she had truly calmed. Only when he heard her breathing steady did he return to his own bed. The next morning, neither mentioned the incident. But that evening, as they again sat on the porch watching the sky turn from blue to pink, Lillian spoke. "The dream started after my parents died," she said without preamble. "Fever took them both within days of each other. I was alone in the house with their bodies before anyone realized." Gabriel remained silent, giving her space to continue if she wished. "In the dreams, I'm back in that house, but I can't find them. I keep searching from room to room, knowing they're there somewhere, but all I find are empty beds with impressions where their bodies should be." She shivered despite the warm evening air. "Frank hated the screaming. He said it was evidence of my weak mind that I was haunted or possessed." "Grief affects people differently," Gabriel offered quietly. "It doesn't make you weak." Lillian turned to look at him, studying his face in the fading light. "You speak from experience." It wasn't a question, but Gabriel nodded anyway. "I lost my brother at Gettysburg. My parents a few years later to consumption. For a long time after, I couldn't close my eyes without seeing them." "Does it ever stop?" she asked, vulnerability clear in her voice. "Not entirely," he admitted, "but it changes, becomes less sharp, more bearable." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell completely, the vast canopy of stars appearing overhead. For the first time since her arrival, the quiet between them felt comfortable rather than cautious. The summer days grew longer and hotter. Gabriel found himself watching Lillian as she worked in the garden, her movements efficient and purposeful. She had sewn herself several simple dresses from the fabric he'd purchased, practical garments that allowed her to move freely as she tended the vegetables or fed the chickens. Her skin had taken on a golden hue from the sun, and her dark hair, which she kept pinned up during the day, would occasionally come loose in tendrils that framed her face. He caught himself wondering what it would look like completely undone, flowing over her shoulders, and immediately felt shame for the thought. He had promised her nothing improper, and he intended to keep that promise, regardless of the unexpected feelings that had begun to stir within him. In late June, Gabriel needed to ride into Silver Creek for supplies. They were running low on essentials, and he couldn't put off the trip any longer. "Would you like to come with me?" he asked Lillian over breakfast. "It might do you good to get away from the ranch for a day." She tensed visibly at the suggestion. "I don't think that would be wise. People in town have long memories." "It's been nearly 2 months," Gabriel pointed out. "Perhaps things have settled." Lillian shook her head firmly. "I've no desire to test that theory, but thank you for the offer." Gabriel respected her decision, though he worried about leaving her alone. It would be his first time away from the ranch since her arrival. "I should be back before sundown," he assured her. "Will you be all right by yourself?" A hint of amusement crossed her features. "I managed on my own before you took me in, Gabriel. I believe I can survive a day alone." He smiled at her gentle teasing. It was a new development in their relationship, these small moments of lightness that had begun to appear between them. "Of course." "I just meant, I know what you meant," she interrupted, her expression softening. "And I appreciate your concern, but truly, I'll be fine." The reception in town was cooler than Gabriel anticipated. He'd done business in Silver Creek for years, and was accustomed to friendly greetings and easy conversation. But as he made his way from the general store to the blacksmith to the feed merchant, he noticed a distinct change in attitude. Conversations halted when he approached, resumed in whispers when he passed. Finally, at the feed store, Walt Jenkins spoke plainly. "People are talking, Hayes." Gabriel secured a sack of grain on his cart before responding. "People always talk, Walt. Doesn't make what they say true. They're saying you've taken up with that James woman in more ways than one. Saying that's why you took her in to have a woman at your disposal without the commitment of marriage." Gabriel's hands stilled on the rope he was tying. "Anyone who knows me should know better than that." "Maybe so," Walt conceded, "but you've got to admit it looks strange. A confirmed bachelor suddenly taking in a woman with her kind of reputation." "Her reputation is based on lies," Gabriel said evenly, though anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. "Frank James was shot dead in the Broken Spur by a man named Miller over a card game. Half the town saw it happen, including you, Walt. The older man had the decency to look uncomfortable. That may be, but there were other stories about her. Strange behavior. Spells of some kind. Frank would come to town with tales. Frank James was a drunk and a liar," Gabriel interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "He died owing money to half the businesses in town, including yours if I recall correctly. Seems to me it was convenient for everyone to believe his widow was somehow responsible, rather than admit one of their own gunned him down over a gambling debt." Walt shifted uncomfortably. "Even so, Hayes, you should consider how it looks. A single man and woman living together without the blessing of marriage, it ain't proper." Gabriel finished securing his purchases and turned to face the merchant fully. "My arrangement with Mrs. James is nobody's business but our own. She works for her keep, nothing more. And I'll thank you to correct anyone who suggests otherwise." He left town with a sour taste in his mouth, the whispers and sidelong glances following him like shadows. The sun was beginning its western descent as he approached the ranch, and he spotted Lillian in the garden, her back to him as she harvested vegetables. She turned at the sound of the cart, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. Gabriel was struck by how at ease she looked here, how naturally she fit into the landscape of his home. She raised a hand in greeting, and something in his chest tightened at the simple gesture. That evening, as they ate the stew Lillian had prepared, Gabriel debated whether to tell her about the town's gossip. She seemed to sense his preoccupation. "Was it very bad?" she asked, setting down her spoon. Gabriel looked up, surprised. "What? In town? Was it very bad the way they treated you because of me?" He considered lying, then thought better of it. "People talk. It doesn't signify." Lillian's expression hardened slightly. "It does, though. Your reputation matters here. Mine was already in tatters, but yours." She shook her head. "I shouldn't have agreed to come here. It wasn't fair to you." "I made my choice with open eyes," Gabriel replied firmly, "and I don't regret it." Her gaze met his, searching. "Why did you do it, Gabriel? Truly, you could have spoken up about what happened that night without taking me in. Why go so far for a stranger?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty. Gabriel set down his own spoon, considering his words carefully. "When I came back from the war, I was different, broken in ways I couldn't explain. For years, I kept to myself, built this place, worked from sunrise to sunset because it was easier than facing what was inside me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I saw how they treated you, how quick they were to believe the worst without evidence, something in me couldn't stand by and watch. Maybe because I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control." Lillian was silent for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his face. "I think you're a good man, Gabriel Hayes, better than this world deserves." "No," he shook his head. "Just a man trying to do right by his conscience." They finished their meal in silence, but something had shifted between them, a new understanding, perhaps, or a deepening of trust. Later, as Gabriel prepared for sleep, he found himself thinking about Walt Jenkins's words about propriety and marriage. The thought of Lillian as his wife sent an unexpected warmth through him, one he quickly tried to suppress. She had come here for safety and work, not to replace one husband with another. Still, as he drifted toward sleep, he couldn't help wondering what it might be like to build a true life with her, not an arrangement of convenience, but a partnership of choice. July brought relentless heat and the need to move the cattle to higher pasture where the grass remained green. For 3 days, Gabriel worked from dawn until dusk, returning to the cabin exhausted and sun-baked. Each evening, Lillian had a hot meal waiting and cool water for washing. On the 3rd night, he found her waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee and an unexpected announcement. "I'd like to ride up with you tomorrow," she said as she handed him the steaming cup. "To help with the herd." Gabriel blinked in surprise. "It's hard work and the terrain is rough." "I'm stronger than I look," she replied with a hint of defiance. "And I know how to ride. Before I married Frank, I helped at the livery, sometimes in exchange for boarding my horse." "You had a horse in town?" This was news to Gabriel. A shadow crossed her face. "Frank sold her to pay a gambling debt. Said a married woman had no need for such frivolities." Gabriel's opinion of Frank James, already low, sank further. "I'm sorry, Lillian. That wasn't right." She shrugged, though he could see the old hurt in her eyes. "It was one of many things that weren't right, but that's past now." She straightened, returning to her original point. "I want to help with the herd. You're working yourself to exhaustion, and 4 hands are better than 2. Gabriel couldn't argue with her logic, though he worried about the physical demands of the work. But the determined set of her jaw told him she wouldn't be easily dissuaded. "All right," he agreed. "We'll leave at first light." They rode out together as the eastern sky began to lighten, the morning air still cool and sweet. Lillian sat easily on her mare, her dark hair braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat Gabriel had lent her. She wore one of her practical dresses with a pair of men's trousers underneath a scandalous arrangement in town, perhaps, but sensible for riding astride. The cattle were grazing in a low meadow about an hour's ride from the cabin. As they approached, Gabriel explained the plan. They would move the small herd, about 30 head in total, up the valley to summer pasture near a clear mountain stream. "We'll need to keep them moving steadily but not too fast," he instructed. "If they get spooked or separated, it makes the job twice as hard." Lillian nodded, listening intently. "I'll follow your lead." Gabriel was impressed by how quickly she took to the work. She positioned herself where he directed, moving her horse with confidence to keep the stragglers in line. By midday, they had the herd moving at a good pace up the valley, the cattle lowing occasionally but generally cooperative. They stopped to rest in the shade of a stand of cottonwoods near a small creek. Gabriel watched as Lillian dismounted gracefully, leading her mare to water. The morning's work had brought a healthy flush to her cheeks and a brightness to her eyes that he found captivating. "You're a natural with the cattle," he commented as they shared the lunch she had packed: bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. "Animals are often easier to understand than people," she replied. "They don't hide their intentions or lie about their needs." Gabriel nodded in agreement. "Is that why you prefer the ranch to town?" "Partly." She took a sip from her canteen. "But mostly I prefer it because it's the first place I've felt safe in a very long time." The simple honesty of her statement caught Gabriel off guard. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "Before we continue," Lillian said, changing the subject, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." She hesitated, then pressed on. "The cabin, you built it yourself?" "Yes, every board and nail," Gabriel confirmed. "Took me the better part of a year." "Why did you position it to face east?" Most people build facing south for the winter sun or north to avoid it in summer. Gabriel hadn't expected the question. He thought for a moment before answering. My mother always said a house that greets the morning sun greets hope itself. She believed there was something restorative about watching night turn to day. He smiled at the memory. Our farm in Ohio faced east for that very reason. Lillian's expression softened. My mother said something similar. She would get up before dawn just to watch the sun rise, even in winter. She said it reminded her that no darkness lasts forever. Wise women are mothers, Gabriel observed. Yes, Lillian agreed softly. They were. They finished their meal in companionable silence before continuing the journey. By late afternoon, they had successfully moved the herd to the summer pasture, a lush alpine meadow surrounded by pines and fed by a clear mountain stream. Gabriel showed Lillian the simple line shack he had built several years earlier. It's not much, he apologized, opening the door to the one-room structure. But it keeps the rain off when I need to stay up here to check on the herd. Lillian looked around the sparse interior, a small stove, a narrow cot, a rough-hewn table with a single chair. It's perfectly functional, she said approvingly, though it could use a woman's touch. You're welcome to make any improvements you see fit, Gabriel offered, surprised by how much he liked the idea of Lillian putting her mark on the space. We'll need to ride up every few days to check on the herd, more often if there's trouble with predators. I'd like that, she said, and the simple statement warmed him more than it should have. They rode back to the ranch as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the valley. Gabriel found himself stealing glances at Lillian's profile, admiring the straight line of her nose, the determined set of her chin. She caught him looking once and raised an eyebrow in question. Just making sure you're not too tired from the day's work, he covered quickly. A small smile played at her lips. I'm more than capable of keeping up with you, Gabriel Hayes. That night, Gabriel lay awake longer than usual, his thoughts circling around the woman sleeping in the room across the cabin. In just 2 months, Lillian had transformed not only his home but his daily existence. The quiet solitude he had maintained for years no longer felt like the refuge it once had. Instead, he found himself looking forward to their shared meals, their conversations on the porch, the simple comfort of another person's presence. But it was more than that, he admitted to himself in the darkness. It was specifically her quiet strength, her resilience, the flashes of humor that appeared more frequently as she grew comfortable in his home. He was falling in love with Lillian James, and he had no idea what to do about it. August brought with it the busiest time on the ranch. The garden yielded a bounty that required preservation for the winter months ahead. Lillian took charge of this task, transforming the kitchen into a fragrant workspace filled with jars of pickled vegetables, preserved fruits, and canned tomatoes. Gabriel marveled at her efficiency and knowledge. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked one afternoon as she sealed another jar of peaches. "My mother taught me, and her mother before her," Lillian replied, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "Women's wisdom passed down through generations." Gabriel nodded, watching her capable hands at work. "My mother used to say that a well-stocked root cellar was better than money in the bank when winter came." "Smart woman," Lillian agreed with a smile. "Speaking of winter, we should discuss preparations. The chicken coop needs reinforcement against the snow, and we should lay in more firewood than you have currently stacked." Her use of "we" didn't escape Gabriel's notice. It suggested she was planning to stay, at least through the winter. The thought both pleased and unsettled him. Their arrangement had never been explicitly defined beyond her initial arrival. She worked for her keep, but he had never paid her actual wages, instead providing for her needs as they arose. It was an unusual situation, one that became more complicated with each passing day. "Lillian," he began carefully, "I've been thinking about our arrangement." She stilled, her hands pausing over the jar she was preparing to seal. "Yes. You've been here almost 3 months now. You've more than earned your place, and I—" He hesitated, uncertain how to proceed. "I want you to know that this is your home for as long as you wish it to be." Relief flickered across her features. "Thank you, Gabriel. I've grown quite attached to this place." Just the place, he wondered but didn't ask. Instead, he pressed on with what he'd been considering for weeks. "I'd like to build you a proper house." Lillian's eyes widened in surprise. "What? The cabin was fine when it was just me, but it's cramped for 2 people. You deserve more space, more comfort." Gabriel took a deep breath, committing to the idea fully. "I've been saving to expand for years, just never had the motivation. But now, with you here, it makes sense." "Gabriel, that's—" She seemed at a loss for words. "That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't accept such a gift. I'm not your responsibility." "It's not charity," he clarified quickly. "Consider it an investment in the ranch. A proper house would increase the value of the property." Lillian studied him, her expression thoughtful. "And where would this house be built?" "I thought perhaps on the rise just north of here," Gabriel suggested. "There's good drainage, protection from the winter winds, and it would catch the morning sun perfectly." A small smile touched her lips at his last words. "You remembered." "Of course," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment, considering. I do mean if we were to build such a house, I would insist on contributing. Not just with labor, but financially as well." Gabriel hadn't expected this. "You have savings?" "Some," she admitted. "Frank didn't know about it. I kept it hidden in the lining of my trunk." "It's not much, but it's mine, earned from my work at the boarding house before we married." The fact that she had maintained this secret resource, this means of escape if needed, spoke volumes about her marriage to Frank James. Gabriel felt a surge of admiration for her foresight and self-preservation. "We could be partners in this," Lillian continued cautiously. "Equal contributors." The word partners hung in the air between them, carrying implications beyond the construction of a house. Gabriel nodded slowly. "Partners," he agreed, the word feeling right on his tongue. They began planning immediately. Gabriel sketched rough designs in the evenings, with Lillian offering suggestions and modifications. They would build a proper 2-story farmhouse with a large kitchen, a formal parlor, and several bedrooms. It would have a wide porch wrapping around the east and south sides to catch both the morning sun and afternoon shade. "We'll need to order lumber from the sawmill in Silver Creek," Gabriel said as they finalized the plans one evening, "and hire help for the raising. It's too big a project for just the 2 of us." Lillian's expression grew troubled at the mention of town. "Will people be willing to help?" Given the circumstances, Gabriel had considered this problem. "Money tends to quiet most objections," he said pragmatically. "And there are men in the area who need work more than they need to uphold gossip. When would we start?" Lillian asked, tracing her finger over the drawing of the front elevation. "We should lay the foundation before the first snow," Gabriel explained. "That gives us about 2 months. We can work on the framing through the early winter if the weather holds, and finish the interior over the winter months." "Where will we live during construction?" Gabriel smiled at her use of "we" again. "Here, in the cabin. It's served me well for 5 years. It can manage another winter." As August turned to September, preparations for the new house began in earnest. Gabriel made several trips to town, returning with contracts for lumber delivery and commitments from workers. Lillian focused on harvesting and preserving the last of the garden's bounty, while continuing to care for the livestock. The cattle were brought down from the high pasture as the first hints of autumn colored the aspens gold. One evening in mid-September, Gabriel returned from town later than expected. Lillian was waiting on the porch, her expression concerned as his horse came into view in the fading light. "I was beginning to worry," she said as he dismounted. "Was there trouble?" Gabriel removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Of a sort. The lumber delivery has been delayed. Miller at the sawmill claims his workers are backed up with orders." Lillian's brow furrowed. "Is that true?" "Partially," Gabriel admitted. "But I suspect he's not eager to be associated with our project." Walt Jenkins wasn't subtle about spreading rumors. Anger flashed in Lillian's eyes. "This is my fault. Your reputation is my own concern," Gabriel interrupted firmly. "And I don't give a damn what Walt Jenkins or anyone else in town thinks." The vehemence in his voice surprised even him. Lillian studied him for a long moment. "You've changed, Gabriel. When I first came here, you were so careful, so contained. Now you're building houses and arguing with merchants." "Perhaps I needed waking up," he replied, his voice softening. "I'd been sleepwalking through life for years." Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a vulnerability that made his heart beat faster. "Gabriel," whatever she had been about to say was interrupted by a distant rumble of thunder. They both looked toward the western horizon, where dark clouds were gathering. "Storm's coming," Gabriel observed. "A big one by the look of it." Lillian nodded, the moment broken. "I'll secure the chicken coop. You should see to the horses." They worked quickly as the wind began to pick up, bringing with it the scent of rain. By the time the first heavy drops began to fall, they had secured the livestock and made it back to the cabin. The storm hit with surprising force, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the eaves. Inside, Gabriel built up the fire while Lillian prepared a simple dinner. They ate to the accompaniment of thunder and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Despite the storm's violence, Gabriel felt a profound sense of contentment in their snug cabin with Lillian across the table from him, her face illuminated by lamplight. After they had cleared away the dinner things, they sat by the fire, listening to the storm. Lillian had taken to mending in the evenings, her nimble fingers working on Gabriel's shirts or her own garments. Tonight, she was darning one of his socks, her head bent in concentration. "I received a letter today," Gabriel said after a comfortable silence. "From an old Army friend who settled in California. He writes that the orchards there are producing more fruit than they can use or sell locally." Lillian looked up from her work. "Is he asking you to join him?" "In a way," Gabriel explained. "He suggests there might be opportunity in establishing regular trade their fruit for our cattle. He believes the railroads will make such arrangements profitable in the coming years." "It sounds promising," Lillian offered. "Would it require travel?" Gabriel nodded. "Eventually, yes. Perhaps for extended periods." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about the future of this ranch. It's sustainable as it is, but with vision and investment, it could be much more." "You're ambitious," Lillian observed, a note of surprise in her voice. "I wouldn't have guessed that about you." "Not for myself particularly," Gabriel admitted, "but for what could be built here." He met her gaze directly. "For what we could build together." The implication hung in the air between them. Lillian set down her mending, her expression serious. "Gabriel, we should talk about what happens after the house is built." His heart beat faster. "What do you mean?" "Our arrangement has always been unclear," she said carefully. "I work for my keep, but now I'm contributing to a permanent structure on your land. It complicates things." "The house will be as much yours as mine," Gabriel assured her. "Your contribution ensures that." That's not how the law would see it, Lillian pointed out pragmatically. Without proper documentation, anything built on your land belongs to you alone. Gabriel hadn't considered the legal implications. We could draw up papers if that would make you feel secure. There's another solution, Lillian said, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her over the storm. One that would clarify everything legally and otherwise. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. Was she suggesting what he thought she was? Lillian, are you? A tremendous crash of thunder directly overhead made them both jump. And simultaneously, the cabin door burst open, slamming against the wall as wind and rain whipped inside. Gabriel leapt to his feet, rushing to secure the door against the storm's fury. By the time he had it closed and barred, the moment had passed. Lillian had returned to her mending, her face unreadable in the flickering firelight. They retired to their separate rooms shortly after, the unfinished conversation hanging between them like the electricity in the storm-charged air. Gabriel lay awake for hours, replaying her words, wondering if he had misinterpreted her meaning. Had she been suggesting marriage? Or merely a more formal business arrangement? The uncertainty kept him from sleep until the storm finally passed, and exhaustion claimed him. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Gabriel rose early, as was his habit, and found Lillian already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She looked up as he entered, her expression giving no hint of last night's interrupted conversation. The storm brought down a section of the corral fence, she reported matter-of-factly. I've already checked the livestock, all accounted for, though rather wet and unhappy. Gabriel nodded, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. I'll repair it after breakfast. They worked side by side throughout the day, clearing debris and mending storm damage. The easy rhythm of their partnership had returned, but Gabriel couldn't help feeling that something important had been left unresolved. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Gabriel finally found the courage to speak. About last night, he began. Before the storm interrupted the foundation for the house, Lillian said abruptly. We should start digging this week while the ground is still soft from the rain. Gabriel blinked at the change of subject. Yes, that makes sense, and we'll need to make another trip to town for supplies, she continued, not meeting his eyes. Perhaps I should accompany you this time, face the gossip directly rather than hiding from it. Gabriel studied her profile, noting the tension in her jaw. Lillian, he said gently, what were you going to suggest last night about clarifying our arrangement? She was silent for a long moment, her hands twisting in her lap. It doesn't matter, she finally said. It was a foolish thought. Tell me anyway, he pressed, his heart pounding. Lillian finally turned to face him, her expression resolute. I was going to suggest that marriage would simplify our situation, legally, socially, practically. She spoke quickly, as if reciting a prepared speech. It would be an arrangement of convenience, of course. A partnership in the true sense of the word. Gabriel felt a curious mix of emotions: hope, disappointment, uncertainty. An arrangement of convenience, he repeated slowly. Yes, she confirmed, her voice steady though her hands continued their nervous movement in her lap. You've been kind to me, Gabriel, kinder than anyone has been in a very long time, and we work well together. It makes practical sense. Practical sense, he echoed, trying to keep the disappointment from his voice. What had he expected? A declaration of love. They had known each other only a few months. Of course, I understand if you're not interested, Lillian added quickly. You've already done more than enough by taking me in. I wouldn't want you to feel obligated. Lillian, Gabriel interrupted gently. May I speak now? She nodded, falling silent. Gabriel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "When I first saw you in town that day, standing accused of something you didn't do, I acted on instinct. I wanted to right a wrong, to offer help where it was needed." He paused, gathering his courage. "But these past months with you have become something I never expected. You've brought life back to this place and to me." Lillian's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent. "I don't want a marriage of convenience," Gabriel continued, his voice growing stronger. "I want a true partnership based on more than practical considerations." He reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. "I believe we could have that given time." Lillian's hand trembled slightly in his. She stopped, seeming to struggle with her words. "After Frank, I promised myself I would never again be dependent on a man's goodwill, that I would maintain my independence at all costs." "I'm not asking you to be dependent," Gabriel assured her. "I'm asking you to consider building something together, equal partners in every sense." "And if my feelings don't match yours?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What then?" Gabriel's heart constricted at the question, but he answered honestly. "Then we continue as we are, friends and partners in this ranch. I would never press for more than you're willing to give." Lillian studied his face in the fading light as if searching for deception. Finding none, she spoke softly. "I care for you, Gabriel, more than I thought possible after everything that happened, but I'm afraid." "Of what?" he prompted gently. "Of being wrong again, of trusting and being betrayed." She looked down at their joined hands. "Of losing this peace we've found here." Gabriel understood her fear. He had built walls around his own heart after the war, keeping the world at arm's length. "I can't promise that everything will be perfect," he said honestly. "But I can promise to always treat you with respect, to value your independence, and to be honest with you, even when it's difficult." A small smile touched her lips. "Those are good promises." "Then let me make one more," Gabriel said, his voice deepening with emotion. "I promise to build you a house that faces the morning sun, where hope greets us with each new day." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes at his words. "I would like that very much." They sat together as darkness fell completely, their hands still joined, possibilities stretching before them like the vast Wyoming sky. The foundation for the new house was laid in early October. Despite the delay with the lumber, Gabriel had managed to acquire enough stone from a nearby quarry to begin the work. He hired 4 men from neighboring ranches to help with the heavy labor men who knew him well enough to trust his judgment and care little for town gossip. Lillian worked alongside them, mixing mortar and positioning stones, her strength and determination earning the grudging respect of the hired hands. By the end of the first week, the foundation was complete, a solid base upon which their future would be built. The lumber finally arrived in mid-October, delivered by a surly miller who accepted Gabriel's payment with barely a word. The framing began immediately, the skeleton of the house rising against the autumn sky. Gabriel worked from sunrise to sunset, driven by the knowledge that winter would soon make outdoor construction impossible. Lillian divided her time between ranch chores and assisting with the building. She proved to have a good eye for measurement and detail, often catching small errors before they became problems. In the evenings, they would sit at the kitchen table, reviewing the day's progress and planning the next steps. It was during one such evening, as they bent over the house plans, that their hands brushed accidentally. The simple contact sent a jolt through Gabriel, and when he looked up, he found Lillian watching him, her eyes soft in the lamplight. "Gabriel," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting more than a marriage of convenience." His heart quickened. "Yes, I think." She hesitated, then continued with more confidence. "I think I would like to try for that too, for something real between us." Gabriel resisted the urge to pull her into his arms immediately. Instead, he asked, "Are you certain I don't want you to feel pressured?" "I'm certain that I want to find out," she replied honestly. "I can't promise my heart completely, not yet. But I want to give it the chance to follow where my mind already leads." It was more than Gabriel had hoped for. "That's all I ask," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Time and opportunity." Slowly, carefully, he leaned forward, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Lillian remained still for a heartbeat, then responded, her lips softening under his. The kiss deepened, becoming a conversation without words, tentative, hopeful, full of promise. When they finally parted, Lillian's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "Well," she said with a small, surprised laugh, "that's a promising start." Gabriel couldn't help but smile. "I believe so." The next few weeks brought changes both to the house and to their relationship. The walls of the first floor were completed before the first snow fell in early November. Gabriel had been right about finishing the interior work during winter. They moved their construction efforts inside, installing floors and interior walls as the world outside turned white. Lillian and Gabriel's relationship evolved with a similar careful construction. Small touches became common between them, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing tools, a quick embrace at the end of a long day. They spoke more openly about their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Gabriel told her about the horrors he had witnessed during the war, the nightmares that had plagued him for years afterward. Lillian shared the full extent of Frank's cruelty, the isolation he had forced upon her, the manipulation that had left her doubting her own mind. "He would move things when I wasn't looking," she explained one night as they sat by the fire. "Small things at first, a cup, a book, my sewing basket. When I mentioned it, he would look concerned, ask if I was feeling well. Later, it became more elaborate. He would claim we had conversations that never happened, or deny ones that did." Gabriel's hands clenched in anger. "He was trying to make you think you were losing your mind." Lillian nodded. "It worked for a time. I began to doubt everything, my memories, my perceptions. The nightmares grew worse, and when I woke screaming, he would tell the neighbors I was having spells." She stared into the fire. "By the time he died, half the town believed I was unstable or possessed. It made it easy for them to believe I might have killed him." Gabriel reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." "You did eventually," she reminded him, "when it mattered most." As December arrived, bringing shorter days and bitter cold, work on the house continued steadily. The second floor was enclosed, the roof complete. Inside, Gabriel installed the large cast iron stove Lillian had selected for the kitchen, a significant investment that had raised eyebrows in town but would form the heart of their new home. One evening, as snow fell heavily outside, Gabriel returned to the cabin to find Lillian sitting at the table with papers spread before her. She looked up as he entered, her expression serious. "I've been thinking about the legal matters we discussed," she said, gesturing to the papers. "About my contribution to the house and the ranch." Gabriel removed his snow-covered coat and hat before joining her at the table. "What have you decided?" "I've drawn up 2 documents," Lillian explained, pushing the papers toward him. "One acknowledges my financial contribution to the construction of the house and grants me partial ownership. The other—" She hesitated. "The other is a marriage contract, specifying that I retain control of my personal property and any future earnings." Gabriel studied the papers, noting the careful language and clear terms. "These are well drafted. Did you write them yourself?" Lillian nodded. "My father insisted I learn about legal matters. He said a woman should never be at the mercy of a man's interpretation of her rights." "Your father was a wise man," Gabriel observed, continuing to read. After several minutes, he looked up. "These terms are fair. I'll sign them whenever you're ready." Relief crossed Lillian's features. "Thank you for understanding. It's not that I don't trust you, Gabriel. It's just, you need security," he finished for her. "After what you've been through, I understand completely." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "But there's one thing missing from these papers." Concern flickered in her eyes. "What's that?" "A date," Gabriel said simply. "For the wedding." A slow smile spread across Lillian's face. "I thought perhaps after the house is completed. In the spring, when everything is new." "Spring it is," Gabriel agreed, lifting her hand to his lips. "A new beginning." As winter settled fully over the ranch, their days fell into a rhythm of work and companionship. Mornings were spent on ranch chores, afternoons on the house, and evenings planning for the future. The physical distance between them gradually diminished as their comfort with each other grew. Lillian no longer startled when Gabriel touched her unexpectedly, and he found himself seeking those small connections throughout the day. Christmas arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. They exchanged simple gifts, a new hat Gabriel had ordered from back east for Lillian, and a handcrafted wooden box she had made for his personal items. But the true gift was the sense of family they had created in their small cabin, the belonging that neither had experienced in years. After a special dinner of roast chicken and preserved vegetables from their garden, they sat by the fire, watching the flames dance while snow fell silently outside. Gabriel had been turning a question over in his mind for days, and finally found the courage to voice it. "Lillian," he began, "there's something I've been wondering." She looked up from her embroidery, her expression open. "Yes. You've never asked me about that night at the Broken Spur, about what really happened to Frank." Lillian's hand stilled. "I know he was shot over a card game." "That's enough." Gabriel shook his head. "There's more to it, something you should know before we marry." She set her work aside, giving him her full attention. "Tell me then." Gabriel took a deep breath. Frank was cheating that night, had been for weeks, according to Miller. But that night he was caught red-handed. He paused, gathering his thoughts. There was an argument. Frank drew his gun first, but Miller was faster. It was self-defense, strictly speaking, but Miller had a reputation as a gunslinger. He fled town that night. "And the sheriff decided it was more convenient to suspect me," Lillian concluded. "Yes, but that's not all." Gabriel met her eyes directly. "Frank was saying things before the shooting, terrible things about you, about what he claimed you had done. He was drunk, trying to impress the other players," he said. Gabriel hesitated, hating to repeat the vile words. "He said he'd broken you, that you were completely under his control. He laughed about it." Lillian's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "That sounds like Frank." "I wanted to confront him," Gabriel admitted. "I almost did. If the argument with Miller hadn't happened, I might have been the one facing him down that night." "And you might have been the one who had to flee," Lillian observed quietly. "Or worse." Gabriel nodded. "When they arrested you, part of me felt responsible. If I had spoken up sooner, challenged his lies about you publicly." "You can't know what would have happened," Lillian interrupted gently. "Frank had convinced many people of my instability long before that night." She reached for his hand. "You did speak up, Gabriel, when it mattered most. You offered me safety when no one else would." "I should have done more," he insisted. "You did enough," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "More than enough." Their eyes met across the space between them, and Gabriel saw in her gaze not just forgiveness but understanding. Without words, they moved toward each other, the physical distance between them disappearing as his arms encircled her, and her head came to rest against his chest. "I love you, Lillian," Gabriel whispered against her hair, the words he had held back for months finally finding voice. I think I have since the day you agreed to come here." She lifted her face to his, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I love you too," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. But I do." Their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey, familiar yet new, comfortable yet thrilling. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Lillian spoke softly against his lips. "Perhaps we don't need to wait until spring for the wedding." Gabriel's heart leapt at her words. "Are you certain?" She nodded, her eyes clear and determined. "I'm tired of letting fear dictate my choices. I know what I want, Gabriel. I want you and this life we're building together." The new year of 1879 dawned bright and cold, the sun rising over a landscape transformed by snow. In the small church in Silver Creek, Gabriel waited nervously at the altar, aware of the whispers and stares of the townsfolk who had come as much out of curiosity as goodwill. Judge Mason had agreed to perform the ceremony, his initial reluctance overcome by Gabriel's firm insistence and the legal papers Lillian had prepared. Walt Jenkins sat in the back pew, his expression disapproving but his presence a tacit acknowledgement of Gabriel's standing in the community. Even Tom Bradley from the general store had come, bringing his wife who had always been kind to Lillian during her time in town. When Lillian appeared at the church door, Gabriel forgot all about the onlookers. She wore a simple dress of deep blue new material he had purchased on his last trip to town, with her dark hair arranged in elegant coils beneath a small hat, adorned with a single white feather. She carried a bouquet of evergreen sprigs and dried flowers from her garden, preserved from the summer. She walked down the aisle alone, her head high, her eyes fixed on Gabriel. He had never seen anything more beautiful than her quiet dignity in that moment, her refusal to be diminished by the whispers that followed her path. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They exchanged simple gold bands and the vows they had written themselves, promises of respect, partnership, and love. When Judge Mason pronounced them husband and wife, Gabriel kissed her with a tenderness that belied the depth of his emotion. The small reception at the hotel dining room was a subdued affair, with most townsfolk maintaining a polite distance. But a few offered genuine congratulations, including Widow Parker, who approached Lillian with surprising warmth. "I may have been hasty in my judgment," the older woman admitted. "Frank James was not an easy man from what I observed. I hope you'll find more happiness with Mr. Hayes." Lillian accepted the olive branch graciously. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. I believe I already have." They left town before nightfall, eager to return to the privacy of their ranch. As they approached, the nearly completed house stood silhouetted against the evening sky, its windows dark but promising future warmth and light. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," Gabriel said as he helped Lillian down from her horse. She smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. "It's a good name, one I chose for myself this time." They spent their wedding night in the small cabin that had witnessed the growth of their relationship, making love with a tenderness born of deep understanding and genuine affection. Afterward, as Lillian lay in his arms, Gabriel marveled at how completely his life had transformed in less than a year. "What are you thinking?" Lillian asked, tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertip. "That I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming territory," he replied honestly. "Perhaps in all the western states," she laughed softly. "And here I was thinking I was the fortunate one." Her expression grew more serious. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that day, if you had ridden away instead?" Gabriel considered the question. "I think about it sometimes, how close we both came to missing this." He tightened his arm around her, "But I prefer to think about the future we're building." "Tell me about it," Lillian requested, nestling closer, This future of ours. Gabriel smiled, letting his imagination wander. The house will be finished by spring. We'll plant a bigger garden, maybe an orchard too, given time. The cattle herd will grow. Perhaps we'll add sheep, as you suggested. He paused, considering possibilities that had once seemed remote. Maybe someday there will be children running around, learning to ride and helping with chores. Lillian was quiet for a moment. I'd like that, she said finally. Children, a family of our own. We have time, Gabriel assured her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Years stretching ahead of us. Years of morning sun, she murmured sleepily, the events of the day finally catching up with her. Years of morning sun, he agreed, holding her close as she drifted into sleep. Spring arrived early that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots beneath. By April, the new house was complete, a sturdy two-story structure with large windows that caught the light from dawn until dusk. Gabriel insisted that Lillian choose every detail of the interior, from the curtains to the arrangement of furniture he had ordered from Denver. On the day they moved in, Gabriel carried her across the threshold in the traditional manner, both of them laughing at the formality of it. They spent that first day arranging their belongings, making the house truly theirs. That evening they sat on the east-facing porch, watching as the full moon rose over the distant mountains. It's perfect, Lillian said, leaning against Gabriel's shoulder. Better than I ever imagined having. The house, he asked, his arm around her waist. The house, the ranch, this life. She turned to face him, her expression earnest in the moonlight. You, us. Gabriel's heart swelled with contentment. It's just the beginning, he promised. The years that followed proved him right. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding gradually as they acquired neighboring land and increased their herds. Gabriel's correspondence with his friend in California led to a profitable arrangement, trading Wyoming beef for California fruit, which they preserved and sold during the winter months. Lillian became known in the region for her preserved goods, and eventually for the apple orchard they planted on the eastern slope of their property. As their success grew, the whispers about her past faded, replaced by respect for her business acumen and generous spirit. In the spring of 1880, their first child was born, a daughter they named Eleanor after Lillian's mother. She arrived just as the apple trees bloomed for the first time, her birth heralded by a profusion of white blossoms visible from the bedroom window where Lillian labored. Gabriel paced the porch during her confinement, terrified by the sounds of her pain yet determined to remain strong for her sake. When the midwife finally called him inside, he entered the bedroom with his heart in his throat. Lillian lay propped against pillows, her face pale but radiant as she held a small bundle. "Come meet your daughter," she invited, her voice tired but joyful. Gabriel approached cautiously, overwhelmed by the tiny, perfect face that peered up at him from the blankets. When he reached out a tentative finger, the baby grasped it with surprising strength. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice breaking, "just like her mother." "She has your eyes," Lillian observed, "and your determination, I think." She wasn't in any hurry to arrive, but once she decided, there was no stopping her. Gabriel laughed softly, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "A Hayes through and through, then." "Eleanor Hayes," Lillian said, testing the name. "It suits her." 2 years later, their son James was born on a crisp autumn morning as the leaves turned gold on the cottonwoods. The family was complete, or so they thought, until 1885, when twin boys, William and Thomas, arrived unexpectedly during a summer thunderstorm that reminded them both of the night years earlier, when they had almost spoken of marriage for the first time. Through it all, the house that faced the morning sun remained the heart of their existence. They added rooms as the family grew, but the essential character remained unchanged, a place of light and welcome, of honesty and love. The porch became Gabriel's favorite spot, where he would sit with Lillian in the evenings after the children were asleep, watching the stars emerge over the land that had given them so much. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat in their customary place, Lillian presented Gabriel with a gift, a leather-bound album containing photographs and mementos of their years together. "I started collecting these after Alina was born," she explained as he turned the pages. "I wanted to preserve everything." Gabriel studied the images, their children at various ages, the ranch in different seasons, celebrations and ordinary moments captured for posterity. Toward the end, he found a sketch of the original cabin, rendered with surprising detail. "You drew this?" he asked, impressed by her skill. Lillian nodded. "I wanted to remember where we began, how far we've come." Gabriel turned to the final page and found a document he recognized, the original agreement he had signed acknowledging her contribution to the house. Across it, in Lillian's elegant handwriting, were the words, "Paid in full with interest of love compounded daily." Emotion tightened his throat as he closed the album carefully. "Best investment I ever made," he said, his voice rough with feeling. Lillian smiled, taking his hand in hers. "Mine too." As they sat together in the gentle evening air, the house behind them filled with sleeping children and the accumulation of a decade's shared life, Gabriel reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this point. One decision, made on a spring morning years ago, had changed everything: his choice to speak up, to offer shelter to a woman no one else would touch. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian asked, echoing a question she had asked many times over the years. Gabriel smiled, bringing her hand to his lips. "About how sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply open a door and invite someone in. And how sometimes the bravest response is to walk through that door, not knowing what waits on the other side," Lillian added. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell completely, the stars appearing one by one above them. In the distance, an owl called, and closer to home, the gentle sounds of their ranch at night surrounded them, the occasional lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the creak of the house settling. "You ever regret it?" Gabriel asked suddenly. "Coming here with me that day?" Lillian turned to him, surprise clear in her expression even in the dim light. "Not for a single moment," she assured him. "Every morning when I wake up and see the sun streaming through our window, I'm grateful all over again." Gabriel drew her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "As am I, my love. As am I." Together, they watched the moon rise over the land that had witnessed their journey from strangers to partners to family, a journey that had begun with an act of kindness and blossomed into a love as enduring as the house they had built to greet each new day.